is there risk or stakes or drama? This is a question for the DM, so the characters don't need to worry about this. This is just something that the DM will decide. Is there a risk that this could go wrong? I'm walking down the street, I'm going to pick up that thing sitting over there. No, there's no risk there. There's no stakes. We don't care whether this happens or not. Is there drama involved? Not really. The answer is no. You just say what happens. So you say, oh, my character's going to do this, and they do it. And so you describe it, and the story continues. However, if there is a risk, I'm going to climb that wall. How high is the wall? Maybe the wall's not that high. So you just go, yeah, your character climbs over it. But if there's a risk, it's like that wall is actually, 2 stories tall, and yeah, sure, there's vines on there, but if you fall, you could hurt yourself. Well, that's risk. Stakes. Maybe you need to climb the wall in a hurry. Maybe it's not just that it's yay high, but you've actually got to jump over it in time to grab that thing that's falling on the other side. Or drama. Maybe you're not meant to be going over the wall, or maybe there's someone watching you while you do it. Is there a risk that you're going to get caught doing this? So if the answer is yes, then we get to roll some bones, which is another word for dice. So sometimes these things aren't going to happen. You're just going to describe, my character does whatever. They climb this wall, and the DM thinks, yeah, who cares, that wall's not important. You climb the wall, you're over the other side. What do you do now? And you go from there. Oh, now I'm going to run across the park and climb that tree. Okay, you do that. So sometimes there's just none of these things apply, so your character just does that. And we're really only caring whether the answer is yes. So if these things apply and you go, oh, hang on, that could be difficult, or there's something interesting could happen if in this situation, then we go to a test. And the test is the DM saying, that sounds like, and again, not necessarily in what I'm going to show you today, but usually your character will have certain skills or abilities, or you're in a particular situation, which will define what it is that you're doing. Oh, you're climbing a wall. Now, it doesn't have to, one of these things doesn't have to apply. You can say that wall isn't all that challenging, I'm going to call that tier 2, and you create a DC and you roll your dice. But maybe you've got a skill that says I'm good at climbing, and that'll affect that. So sometimes we need to consider how good a character is at a particular thing. Ultimately, we're looking for a difficulty class, which if you know D&D, you'll know what a DC is. That's what you've got to roll equal to or higher than to succeed on a test. In this system, the DM just picks something from 1 to 10. X is just the Roman numeral for 10. So 1, 2, 3 or 4, 5, 6, 7, down to 10. It's basically 3 times the tier. So, for example, I've written some up here. Simple, easy, average, challenging, something like that. So you say, oh, it's probably pretty average to climb this wall. That's tier 3, so we'll call it a DC of 9. And that's what you're trying to roll on 2d20. Now, again, are you trained in that thing? Depends on how you're creating your character, depends on the options, depends on the particular game that you're playing. Now today, we will probably make up some pretty basic characters. They might be trained in 1 or 2 things. You might just describe those things. So when you think about a game, and you think, oh, is my character good at performing or sleight of hand? Those are just descriptors of something that you do, right? So if you're describing a character, maybe your character is just good at hiding what they do. Now that covers sleight of hand, it covers stealth, it covers them lying to people's faces. That's still hiding what you do. So sometimes, whether it's a skill or a talent or just a description, that might be all you're doing. So when you're creating a character, and again, we'll get to this in later weeks, this is not quite so important today, but training can be complex, it can be very specific, a list of specific skills, say, that you've got on your character sheet, or it could just be a description. In this system, all that does is reduce the tier by 1. So instead of it being tier 3 to climb, you're like, I'm good at climbing and jumping and athletics or something like that. You say, well, now it's tier 2. So instead of a DC 9, it becomes a DC 6. You're rolling a lower DC, so it's more likely that you're going to succeed. Then we get to our 2d20, the fun part. So you roll your 2 dice, and you've got 3 outcomes, strong, weak, or bad. So strong is if you get 2 that are the same as or higher as your DC, that's called a strong outcome. You get 1 of each, so let's say it's DC 9, you get an 8 and an 11. That's a weak outcome, and if you miss both of them, that's a bad outcome. Now you'll notice there's 3 options here. It's not 2, it's not succeed or fail, or pass or fail. There's 3 options, and that gives the DM a lot more flexibility to say, what happened here? Was it something really good? You did exactly what you said? Was it something really bad? So these are kind of like your pass and fail, your strong and your bad. But then there's this interesting one in the middle called weak, which is something that, in my experience, is actually the most interesting outcome, where you get some of what you wanted, but not all of it. So you're climbing up the wall, you get a weak outcome, maybe you slip and fall and it takes you longer to climb over the wall. Maybe as you're climbing over your wall, your sword falls out of its sheath and you're like, oh no, and it's like, do you jump off the wall to grab your sword and it's going to take you longer to get back over it, or do you leave your sword behind and think, well, I'm probably not going to need that now, I'll just keep going, it's more important to get over the wall. So that's about interesting choices. And again, that's more about the DM describing the situation. It depends a lot on the context of what's happening, but that's a really interesting one. And all of these just lead to the narrative. It's all about telling a story. So really, all of this stuff here helps you tell a story. And that's what D&D does. You think of characters in D&D as being wizards and fighters and rogues. You're just telling a story. They just happen to be good at particular things. And as you go and you fight monsters, you're telling a story about fighting monsters. This system is a bit more flexible than that. There's less focus on combat, and any action can be just as interesting as combat. A DM can still make this all about smashing goblins in the face and killing orcs and dragons and stuff like that. If that's the game you want to play, you can still play that game. So as you tell the story from the outcome, you've climbed your wall, you've gone over, you've thought, no, I'm just going to let my sword fall, I need to get over this wall, I'm in a hurry. The narrative, the story continues. And then you just keep describing what your character's doing, or other players describe what their characters are doing. There's another part of this, again, not so important for today, but the DM has 2 ways to interact here. So in this game, the Dungeon Master doesn't roll dice. So you don't have, I swing and I miss, and the DM rolls and they go, oh, the goblin also misses, or the dragon misses. Next character says, oh, I cast my spell and I hit. Okay, roll dice. And then the DM says, okay, the dragon eats the wizard. Okay, it doesn't go back and forth like that. It's more about your actions as players have an impact on the story, and the DM makes what's called soft moves, which is basically a description of what might happen if you don't do anything. So the boulder is falling down the hill and you're standing right in the way, what do? And you go, oh, I get out my watch and I look at my phone and I go, oh, that's interesting, the weather's going to be this, it's okay. Then you get a hard move, which is like, well, this boulder flattens you because you didn't get out of the way. So that's just a very obvious example of that, where soft moves are suggestions and hard moves are the outcomes for that. And that's a way to prompt the characters, this important thing is about to happen, which then gets more actions. Then you say, oh, I'm going to jump out of the way of this boulder. Is there risk? Is there stakes? Is there drama? Maybe it's not that hard to get out of the way of the boulder. And you just say, I jump out of the way. And the DM says, okay, you jump out of the way. The boulder comes rushing down. However, that boulder's now tearing down the hill towards your family's village or something, and it's like, how do I stop it from, do I yell, do I warn people? That's all interesting stuff, right? So that's where the story goes from there. So again, it's just about the story. Actions, the DM can suggest stuff, things happen. If they're ignored, they become more significant, and this whole cycle just continues. Then we've got clocks, which again, I don't actually talk about in this, which I realise I probably should have when I put that together. But clocks are pretty simple. We can break down any task or challenge or a monster or a conversation, any interaction you have with the world, into one of these, just very simple. It doesn't even matter. The DM will just choose one of these and kind of go, oh, that's pretty simple. Maybe we'll just call that 2. Maybe it's got 4. Maybe it's quite complex. Maybe this is a mystery that you're solving or something. And every time you get one of these, maybe this is worth 2 ticks, maybe this is worth 1, and maybe this is worth none. So each time you try to solve the mystery, if you get a strong result, you get to colour in 2 of these sections and go, wow, you found something out there. And you can do this with monsters. Maybe that's a dragon, maybe this is a goblin, maybe this is something in between. And so as you're fighting, you're not necessarily whittling down, 84 hit points. You're really just trying to beat the clock. Maybe it's got a clock for hit points or, its health. Maybe it's got another clock for, something else, being frightened away or being tricked somehow. So those clocks aren't necessarily always the same thing. They just represent the challenge in front of you. And again, maybe climbing, a wall or something like that has more complications. So you need more of these ticks. You get halfway up. With a weak result, you get halfway up the vine and you've got to wait. Now, if you also drop your sword, do you go all the way down to the bottom to pick up your sword and then you're going to start again? Do you keep going? With a really strong result, you might get up and over and nothing to decide there. So this is just a way of representing challenge, and your own characters might have a clock for your health, which is, probably one of these. Maybe you've only got 4 hit points. They won't be hit points, they'll just be a clock that if you get a bad outcome, maybe you've got to, colour in one of your health clocks. And when that gets full, you pass out or you collapse or you die. It'll depend on what your DM says. It'll depend on, the stakes and the drama involved. Maybe this is you feeling, afraid. And as soon as it gets filled up, you run away because you're afraid of the dragon or whatever it is that you're fighting at that particular time. They don't necessarily need to be hit points where you collapse or are unconscious or whatever that case may be. So that's basically how the system works. It takes a little bit of time to get your head around it. So if you're still thinking, I'm used to D&D, you just roll 1, you succeed or you fail, that's fair enough. This is quite different to that. However, once you get a hang of the, you describe what you're doing, is there risk? Again, this is for the DM to determine. As a player, you don't need to worry about it. That sounds like we're, going to use some kind of skill or ability. Maybe none of those apply. Maybe you just decide on the tier, get a DC, roll your 2d20. You're going to have one of 3 outcomes that will then tell you, along with the DM. Sometimes, if you get a strong result, you'll probably describe what you do based on, if you say, I'm going to climb that wall as quickly as possible. That's what you do. If you get a strong result, you can't say, I climb the wall and I land on that goblin and I kill it, because that's not what you said you were going to do. And so again, linking these things, what you're going to do is really important because that's what tells you what these are. It's also what helps the DM choose whether it's simple, easy, because if you said, it's easy to climb the wall, but I want to jump over and also kill that goblin, well, maybe that's challenging to do in one shot. So then all of a sudden you're rolling a higher DC, less likely to get a strong result where you get to say you do what you do. Maybe it's weak. Do you get over the wall? Do you kill the goblin? Maybe you do, but in killing the goblin it screeches and the 12 other goblins around there all turn around and go, what's happening over there? Depends on the context. So again, ultimately it's all about the narrative. Then you get more actions. DM can also suggest things. And then you're just colouring in clocks along the way to see how things go. Yep.
I just had a moment of thought. Do you reckon it would be a good addition to have the idea of using objects around the battlefield? If there's a battle, you could throw it at the raging drunk guy and stuff.
It's all about the description. So if you think there's something there that you could use, or if you imagine something, you can say, is there something lying around that I can use? You might say, hey, there's something, I've dropped my sword before, so now I need to can I pick up a chair and whack this goblin with the chair? The DM will say either there are no chairs in this room, but there's a broken table over there, or they'll go, yeah, sure, there's a chair, pick that up and do it. And so it's really about thinking about the common imagined world. Again, the story. It's the story that matters.
And if you pick up the chair, is it a strength check or a dexterity check?
Well, at the moment, it doesn't matter. It's just a difficulty. The DM will decide. So again, we'll get to character creation. All of those stats are available to create characters with. There will be specific skills and talents and things like that. But for example, today, when we're playing, all characters are basically the same. You might give a description of your character to say what they're good at, and maybe that'll affect some of the roles. But basically, this determines, so it won't really matter whether it's strength or dexterity or anything at this particular point. In future iterations, it will. But as a basic thing, at the moment, we're thinking about, I'm going to, how hard is that? And then that's what you'll roll.
What about levels?
There's no levels.
Levels? Never heard of it.
We don't need to bother with levels here. So basically, I mean, levels are one of those things that kind of, every time you level up, you get a bunch of abilities, right? Depending on your character class. Here, once we get around to character creation a little bit later, you just pick more skills or talents. So instead of being told by the book, oh, because you're a rogue, now you get these three things. You get evasion, or you get, you can still choose those things. You can still choose things that align with your idea of your character. You just don't get forced to. So if you're a fighter and you would normally get action surge, but you want evasion.
Is there like any other guys things or anything else other than skills?
Well, that's the skills of what, there will be, so there'll be talents as well, which are kind of like different ways of using skills.
So no more power, not stronger?
Yeah, you'll get that. So that's what the skills and the talents will define. So instead of being told by the book what you want, you can just pick them yourself. So if you imagine thinking, oh, I'm going to go up a level, it doesn't matter, you don't pick a class. So you can say, well, I'm going to choose I'm going to be slightly better at magic, or I'm going to be slightly better at sneaking, or I'm going to be slightly better at fighting things, or I'm going to have more endurance in a fight. Those are the sort of things you'll be picking, rather than just arbitrarily being given a list based on something you chose 6 levels ago. You can choose it yourself each time. Does that make sense? Yeah. So later on, so the future, so this is not everything, this is just the very, very start. So, sorry, did you have a question?
Not a question, but just a statement about that is that I think that if anyone's got any doubts about this in terms of comparing it to D&D, this is going to help your role playing. This is a role play heavy system, and it's like if you go back to D&D, you're going to be an expert at playing D&D because of the way this is set up.
I would
you're
like
going to be a better
say.
player after
Yeah.
playing it.
Because it's about the story, and it's focusing on your character, not necessarily as a bunch of stats. How powerful is this? How difficult is that? It's more about telling a story based on what you're going to do, how the DM interacts and chooses a difficulty, and then these outcomes are going to be a bit more interesting than just succeed and fail all the time. So at the moment, you've got this very basic, couple of pages of information, and one of the reasons why we did this is we didn't want to overwhelm you with a 25-page document with all of the rules all at once. So later, we will get to skills, we'll get to stress, which is kind of like hit points, but it can be a social stress as well, it can be things like fear, yeah?
Sorry, this is just more like a question about the idea of wild magic. Do you reckon using this rule system, do you reckon wild magic would be way more bizarre and more fun to use?
Depends on how you describe it. So, for example, there will be magic rules, but it'll be just basically the same thing. It'll be, I'm going to cast a spell that is, wacky. It's going to transform that thing into a sheep. Yeah, I'm going to turn that ogre into a sheep. That's what I want to do. Now, that's probably not going to be simple, easy, or average, right? It's probably going to be one of the more hard things to do. But if you've got some ability in magic, you're like, well, hard things for me aren't quite so hard because I have skill in magic, right? So it becomes easier to do things like that. So the wilder your idea is, sure, the harder it will be, but that's like, high DCs, if a monster's got a high saving throw in Dungeons and Dragons, that's exactly the same thing.
Will we get an opportunity to play D&D instead of D&Dzy?
Probably not this year. This system is designed to replace that, so that when new players come along or people without a character that we don't need to worry about handing them, a sheet with 12 pages of information they don't really understand.
So,
It will be,
Sorry?
is this permanent?
yeah, pretty much. It will be offered to the older group, so the 16 to 25-year-old group meet on Fridays. They are self-sufficient, so they can run D&D tables or whatever system they like. We also have immersive worlds that'll be during the holidays. We will have D&D tables at there as well. So we'll have a D&D easy there too as well. We're not sure, but
And
yeah,
keeping in
there'll be
mind,
other
you
opportunities.
can play D&D anytime
Exactly,
if
yeah.
you want. Like, most of the basic rules are available online. You can certainly, you don't necessarily need all the books to play D&D. You can just download the basic rules, which you can, there's what are they called? The generic rules, the name escapes me, but you can download a basic version of D&D and just play it with your friends whenever you like.
And we've still got that link to D&D Beyond. So if you, I'll resend. Actually, someone asked me about it today as well. So D&D Beyond have all the systems, all the stuff on there. So you can still create a character on there and still bring it to this. It's not. It's just you won't use it in the same way. But also you'll still have access to our free resources by joining our campaign as well. So yeah, that has all that.
This is basically, it's doing exactly the same thing. So the campaigns that we've been playing in the past have been set in Blue Vault, for example. This will still be set in Blue Vault.
Yeah.
You can still play, if you've been playing a bard or a rogue or something, you can still create a character that is a bard or a rogue. It's just using it's just using 2d20s instead of one, and there are less rules to learn. You're still telling the exact same stories, you're still in the exact same place, so the story hasn't changed at all. It's only the what the DM does in terms of these, and it's still kind of just rolling a number on a d20. So you're doing the basic, exactly the same thing as you will be doing before. It's just instead of having a list of, equipment and spells and specific abilities that were given to you by what it said in the book, you'll just choose them yourself and say, oh, my character can do this, or it can do that, or it can do the other. And so you'll just create a bespoke character that can be exactly the same as the character you played before.
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
Yeah.
It might help alleviate some fears if you grab that red marker and where it says, is there risk, stakes, drama, if you add comedy?
Oh yeah.
Comedy.
Comedy,
Yeah.
So there'll still be, wizards getting turned into sheep and...
Yeah, you can still do everything with this that you can do with D&D. In fact, with D&D you might think, oh, wouldn't it be great if I hadn't chosen that spell, if I could choose this spell? And instead you're just using a magic skill. So you can actually do any spell you want at any time. It only depends on how difficult it is. So instead of casting Magic Missile and saying, oh, well the rules say that Magic Missile I don't need to make a roll, I just roll my 3d4. Yeah, sure, spells like that don't exist specifically, but you can still say, I just want to do a little bit of damage with some magical bolts. And maybe that is easy. And so you roll and the outcome ends up being basically the same. It's just that your character has less hit points and every monster has less hit points. So when you're fighting things, you've got less hit points to play with, but so do they. So instead of it taking 45 minutes to have a big combat where one person after the other takes their turns, then the monsters all have a go and 15 minutes later everyone's had one turn. Sometimes in this, you might determine it with one roll. Does it cost you some stress to actually take out that goblin? Maybe the goblin's only got one stress point. And so some of these things are going to be very, very simple. And it's really only here at strong, weak and bad, rather than hit and miss, sometimes it's just going to be in here, you're going to have a difficult choice to make. That's really the biggest difference between this and D&D, except for the fact that D&D has heaps of really specific rules that you won't have to memorize or learn or anything like that. Once you get the hang of this, and it'll take a couple of sessions before it all kind of sinks in and you work out how it works. But this is all about the story, which is actually what D&D's about. D&D is about telling a story, right? Everyone sits down, they play a particular character, they fight a bad guy, and you tell the story. So when you go home and you tell you text your friends that night and you go, oh, listen to what I did at D&D, it's exactly the same thing. You're just going to tell people about the story. You're just using a slightly different set of mechanics to do that exact same thing in the exact same setting with the exact same characters. If you choose to recreate
Yeah.
your character in this system, which you can,
Yeah.
it does the same thing. So it's not a different, we're not changing it to cyberpunk or, some futuristic system or something setting in a boring modern bureaucratic world where you've just got to go to work and do paperwork all day.
Oh, specialized.
If I'm casting a spell, do I roll a d20 or
Yeah.
the dice that the book says?
No, so just like you would, so for example, with D&D, there's two types of spells. One spell where you try to hit someone else, or one spell where it happens and they try to avoid the effect, right? That's the two types of spells that you get in D&D. Basically, instead of rolling one dice, you're rolling two dice, and then this just tells you how successful that is. And again, if you're casting a spell in D&D, someone says, oh, their armor class is 16. So you need to roll 16, so you roll your dice, you add your charisma or whatever the bonus is, right? And you're trying to beat 18. All you're doing is you're using two dice to see whether you get 18 twice or once or not at all. And then that will determine whether the spell succeeds or fails, or to what degree it succeeds or fails. So you're basically doing the exact same thing, it's just using a slightly different system where there's 3 outcomes instead of 2. And the other difference is that rather than the spell description telling you exactly what that spell does, you get to describe what it does. And based on, I'm going to cast a spell, Vicious Mockery, or how, you can say, I want to cast Vicious Mockery that makes that person run in fear, right? Now that's probably going to be more difficult than a basic Vicious Mockery that just makes them feel bad about themselves for a minute. But that's up to the DM to decide. The consequences of the action, the more significant what I'm going to do is, the more challenging the tier is going to be, and that just decides what number you need to beat to roll on your 2d20. And so it's actually the exact same thing, just with a very slight change, because we've got 3 outcomes, we're rolling 2d20 instead of 1, but it's basically the same thing, except you've got more flexibility in what you want to do, and you're never going to run out of spell slots. You
Well,
just
that's
keep
handy.
casting. Yeah. So that's another important thing. So with magic and abilities, if you want to do something, you just say, that's what I'm doing. You don't need to worry about resources running out, because built into these 3 outcomes, the reason why D&D gives you 3 spell slots and not infinity is because some of those powers are very significant in the context of how D&D is set up. Its mechanics and its hit points and its armor classes and all these complicated things, its actions, its reactions, its bonus actions, all that kind of stuff is built around a system that's designed to fight monsters tactically and strategically, and that's mainly what you're doing. So in D&D, you've probably noticed you have shenanigans and then you get into a fight, and the rest of the game is just a fight. And you can still do that here, except that fight's just going to be much more efficient. So maybe instead of getting into one big fight every session, you get into 3 fights instead. It doesn't stop you fighting stuff, it just means that it's going to be more efficient. But it's also going to be a little bit more risky. So then you've got stakes. Oh, how many of these fights can I afford to get in? I've already, maybe once you're down to here, and you're like, do we need to rest? Do we need to try to get rid of some of our stress? Or do we push on and try to crest that last, goal, challenge, whatever it is that you're up against? Because at the end of the day, it's the story that matters. So if you burst into the wizard's tower and the wizard's there, then you're still confronting the wizard. Doesn't matter whether you're confronting them over 45 minutes while you gradually whittle down their hit points and force them to use their spells, and then you resist and you counterspell and you use all these things according to D&D's rules. Here, it's the exact same thing. You're just describing what you're doing each time. The DM's deciding how challenging that's going to be, and then what kind of outcome do you get.
I've got 2 more questions I've noticed.
I feel like you're turning into a Disney movie. You're like, and in the end, it doesn't even matter. Everyone lives happily ever after.
Well, maybe people won't live happily ever after. That's the whole thing. You can still get taken out in this system just like you can in D&D. It's just a little bit harder to predict when it's going to happen.
A 10-second fight.
And For anyone who knows anything about storytelling, that's called tension. And tension is good. You don't realise it, but when things are tense, they're fun. And this system, because you've only got your 4 hit points or whatever it happens to be, now they're not hit points, but I'm just going to call that because it's easier to understand. If you only got 4 hit points, then you've got to guard each one of those very, very carefully. Whereas if you've got 48, I'm a warrior and I've got 48 hit points, and this thing can only do 6 hit points to me at a time. You can wait in there and chop away at them. Doesn't matter if you hit or miss. It's kind of like until you get down to your last 6 hit points, you're immune to worrying about that. Whereas this system is different. And again, for the monsters as well, they don't have 48 hit points. They've only got 4 as well. So they're easier. It's easier to kill and be killed, I suppose, or be taken out. I should say. It's not always killing. So,
We had another question. Did you have a question? Did you have a question? No, you're right. Okay. Cool.
So it probably seems really confusing at the moment because there's lots of new stuff to learn, but really, if we scrub out the tiers here and forget about that, we just look at those as DCs. These are Dungeons and Dragons. DC 12, Armor Class 12. Call it what you will. That's just the number you've got to roll. And 2d20 is the same as 1d20, except you're just working out whether you get both of them, one of them, or none of them. So again, in D&D, this doesn't have weak, so you've only got the 2. So you've got a 50% chance of bad and a 50% chance of good, whereas here, you've only got a 30% chance of bad, a 30% chance of good, and 30% of a little bit in between. So it's actually a better outcome in most cases. Yeah.
One thing I like about the system is like, you can do it in like any kind of thing. It's not just fantasy.
Exactly. Yeah. And because it's generic, it's not. In that respect, it's not like D&D. It's not built because there's no character classes. You just decide what your character looks like. You're not forced to play. You know, you can make this Star Wars or Star Trek or Game of Thrones. Anything. You can just turn this into anything you want. It's not built around a
Disney
very
movie.
specific, or a Disney
Exactly.
movie.
You could be
Yeah.
a princess.
Yeah, exactly right. You want to play a Disney princess? Go right ahead.
That's it.
Rapunzel from the castle.
Yeah. What was your
Yeah,
question?
that's it. I'm
You
working through
said
that.
50-50 with strong and bad, and then 30.
Okay, 33.33 recurring percent. Yes, that's well spotted. I was being generic there.
Well, thanks heaps, Burke. That's really helpful.